I recently made a video about common tech sales questions and answers, and I recommend if you haven't seen that, you watch it after this video. Because of that video, a lot of people reacted very positively to it, and I wanted to make a part 2 video focused on later round interviews, the types of questions and answers you can expect at that point. Like I mentioned in the first video that I made, when it comes to your personal story, when it comes to all the things about your background that you want to convey, you need to take control of how you're conveying that, how you're leading that conversation, and that's something I document very well in the first video that holds up very strongly in the first and second rounds of interviews. Now there's elements of that definitely apply in later stage with third round interviews, maybe with a VP, and your fourth round final exercise type of interview. You still want to command that message of your background. You still want to have those short and succinct stories. And as a good rule of thumb, almost at any time outside of the exercise itself, your answers should be striving to be 60 to 90 seconds. The worst thing you can do is ramble on. Like, don't get me wrong, if you have something that's like very meaningful, that takes a long time to explain, and these later rounds, they are typically going in more depth on your background, looking at a few different things, right? If there's situation appropriate, you don't have to cut yourself off at 60 seconds, but it's a very good practice to look up different questions that you might be asked, whether it's how to handle objections, how you might handle talking to a CEO, and practice responses in that 60-second range. Because especially game time, especially in the interview, you get nervous, you don't realize you're rambling, people's eyes are glossing over, and you start to make yourself look really bad. Whereas if you had a short answer that's incomplete, you can ask them if they want more context. If you're talking about your background, you can ask them if they want more detail. They're welcome to probe into certain things further, right? All that to say, shorter is almost always the best route. But as we get into these final round interviews, you may be asked more tactical questions, and this is where I think it's worth preparing in a little bit different of a focus, right? I mentioned some earlier already in this video of how would you handle talking to a CEO? Tell me about times where you've presented to leadership. Tell me about a time where you received difficult feedback, right? Tell me about a time where you outperformed your peers. That was a question I had recently in an interview process that candidly caught me a little off guard, and I had to prepare for that. And while we could spend hours talking about all the potential questions, I'll mention a few, but again, abstract away the specific information. We're striving for a 60-second answer, and before the interview, we're just thinking of common answers to those questions. And again, sales is a little bit different, like I've mentioned in the other video as well. It's not necessarily like if you get the wrong answer, there really isn't a perfect answer, right? The way that I may talk to a CEO, because of my technical background, because of the way that I do things, might be different and still get the same result. So there's no one answer, and that's what I would emphasize again and again. But that being said, let's talk through a few specific questions and how you might answer them. So as an example, later stages, especially at bigger tech companies, it's very common to see STAR method questions. If you're not familiar with that process, look it up real quick, but it's situation, task, action, and result. Basically, they're just asking, like, tell me about a time when. You might also hear this referred to as behavioral questions. So they want you to tell about a time where you received difficult feedback, right? And so there's no right or wrong answer here. Again, it's about the thought process and having a couple stories prepared with this line of thinking. You're going to present it as it's an actual authentic story, as to where if you're not prepared at all, you're going to be thinking on your feet, and then like you may have a good story, but you may not articulate it well. So again, no one answer here, but as an example, there was one time at a startup that I was at where I received difficult feedback from a manager because I disagreed with the sales policy that they had just rolled out. If I'm answering the question as an example, so yeah, great question. You know, one of the things that happened at a startup that I was at one time was our sales team had rolled out a couple of different sales methodologies over the course of 3 months, and I expected it to change. We had a new product, but we kind of reached this point where it felt like we were changing things so much that it was really difficult to even test and see if what we were doing in the first place truly was working or not. And so when they rolled out a new sales methodology, I disagreed with it vocally on a group call with about 20 people on the phone. And unfortunately, it kind of got a little bit heated, and I probably overstepped and overreacted, whereas I probably should have followed up in that situation one-on-one. So after that, I had a deep discussion with our manager. We talked it out and we handled it, and it was a great conversation we had. And I think in hindsight, it was probably good. Some of those concerns finally came to the light. But I think, again, what it fostered was better communication going forward. One, me as an individual contributor, when management is asking us to do things, especially early on, it's best to take it in, it's best to test it and try and get results quickly. But also what came of that is management realized that maybe they were putting too many things on the table for us. They were changing so often without context. It became really difficult for us as individual contributors to do our job. So really going forward, what that meant, we had better communication. There was a lot more interaction when they were considering changing things in the first place, as opposed to just saying, hey, here's what we're doing now, right? And I think overall it was good. It was a tense moment, and I definitely acknowledge where I may have overstepped. but overall, I think it was good. It really allowed our team to get much closer and work more effectively together. And again, there's many different ways that you can answer this question. You can go more formally of that STAR method, lay out the situation, lay out the task, lay out your action, lay out the results, but that conversational way as well is fine. And conversations like that, like for instance, that's a genuine answer I gave at an interview I had recently, and the manager was like, actually, that's a great example. I can totally relate. We had a situation like that 6 months ago where we released a new cloud product, right? And so my point being, like, none of that is inauthentic, and I'm never gonna sit here and say the hack of how to answer a question optimally, right? Like, just really dig into your experience, and it's more impressive if you're coming with a well-articulated story as opposed to having one that's like, and me and my manager, you know, we're best friends now. He was in my wedding. Like, you know, like they don't really care about that stuff. It's more like, take me through a very real situation. Your ability to articulate that story, your ability to walk them through both and acknowledge things that you did wrong, but also how it brought light to maybe a broader problem that maybe, again, wasn't even 100% solved, but had a much better resolution going forward. That's the kind of framework you're shooting for. You don't have to make it like you're the best person ever. You received constructive feedback and then you won the Heisman Trophy, right? Like, we don't have to go into that level of making yourself a hero. But the biggest mistake that I see is people don't prepare for those types of questions, like, tell me about a time when you received constructive feedback. Tell me about a time when you communicated with a very important executive. Tell me about a time when you overcame a very difficult challenge, right? If you don't have stories prepared for that, when you're thinking about it on your feet, again, you may have a good story, but because you haven't thought through it, because you haven't thought through how you're going to articulate it, when you're actually in the game time situation, you don't represent yourself as well as you could. Now, definitely, again, I will call out different videos. I don't want to go too deep into feedback for the exercises that you have, like a mock cold call, a mock discovery call. I do highly recommend, if you're doing a discovery call for the first time, I made a video about command of the message, how to lead a tech sales discovery call. That's a great point of reference if you've never done one, or if you are, you have done one before, but you want to brush up on your skills. So I'll leave it to that video to get really specific on how to handle the exercise. But there's going to be more tactical questions now as well, right? Like, tell me even about compensation expectations. Tell me about what your expectations are in this role. They may ask you point blank, like, hey, we're excited about interviewing you. Do you have other conversations going on? And I know it seems trivial, but preparing for these also in the right way can set you up in a great position for the company who might be really interested in you and also worried if you're talking to other people. They may try to expedite you through that process if you present it properly. So, like, as an example, let's say, hey, I know we've got one more interview left. We really like what we've seen so far. We hope you do well. We do want to know, are you interviewing with anyone else? Do you have other conversations going? And at this point, I always recommend just saying, candidly, I do have a few conversations going. That being said, I've very much enjoyed my experience here. I will definitely let you know as I get to final stages. I'm about at the same stage with the other companies that I'm speaking with as I am today. Now, obviously, maybe you are final round or already have an offer from another company. If so, like, feel free to say that. Don't mention the company name. Don't mention the numbers in terms of salary that they've offered you. But by creating respectfully and opening that transparent dialogue about other conversations you have going on, that is going to expedite the interview process. And it worked in my favor when I recently went through the interview process and recently got a job. Also, around compensation expectations, again, if you're breaking into sales for the first time, it's a little bit different than if you have experience and you're trying to negotiate for a higher salary. But if you're breaking in for the first time, maybe you're in a position where getting a 75 to 80 to 90K job is fine, and you want to take that and you're not in a position to negotiate, what I recommend is looking on Glassdoor, looking on sites like RepView, making sure you have an understanding of what the typical range for OTE is, and then as opposed to saying a specific number, like as an example, let's say I look up Google and their typical SDR is paid anywhere from 75,000 to 90,000 OTE. You're fine with any number in that range. What I recommend is just saying, hey, I've looked online. It seems like the typical range for the SDR position is 75,000 to 90,000. That range is good for me. I do have a couple conversations going on, but I think they're all within that ballpark. What you've done is said, okay, like, I'm not going to come in here and be unreasonable and ask for 150,000 as an SDR, but you've also put pressure on them now to acknowledge the range of 75,000 to 90,000, and knowing that you have a conversation or two going on in parallel, if they really like you, they're going to come to you with that $90,000 offer out of the gate, right? I've also made a video about how to negotiate between multiple offers if you have that, so I don't want to focus on that too much here. But again, having that concise answer. Like, when I was graduating college, I did look at sales. I ultimately didn't go to sales right out of college, but I had someone ask me, how much money do you want to make in 5 years? And I was so naive, I didn't even have an answer for that. And I totally fumbled, and I was like, well, I want to be making a lot of money. And it really made me look like unprepared and naive as to what sales truly was. So just, again, don't overcomplicate it. Short and sweet. Nice and simple. You know, in the case of compensation, in the case of talking to other companies, it's okay to say you have a conversation or two going on in parallel. But if you do like the opportunity you're at, reiterate, I really like what I've seen so far. I'm really excited to continue in this process. I do have a couple conversations going in parallel. They are in this compensation range, so there's no real discrepancy there. But I will keep you posted as I get an offer from them, and I look forward to progressing and have a really good feeling about what I've seen so far from company, right? And lastly, on the more tactical things, they may ask you, tell me about a time you spoke with an important person. Tell me about a time you talked to a CEO. Maybe as an example, you were an engineer and you can say like, hey, you know, when I was an engineer, I spoke with our VP of engineering about a process that was super inefficient. That's a fine story. Like, don't worry so much about having to fit the criteria successfully. You can even parlay that into saying like, hey, you know, as an engineer, I got a lot of exposure up to the VP of engineering and I briefly spoke to the CTO at times. One of the things that I drove, especially with our VP of engineering, was an initiative around how to make something more efficient, right? But one of the things I want to break into sales for, one of the things I've got a little bit of exposure to talking with sales team members at my last company is that exposure to the C-suite, that exposure to driving technical deals from a financial perspective and really creating a case for the return on investment, right? These are things you can parlay, especially at the entry level of sales. That's a good answer, as opposed to like if you're an enterprise account executive that's supposed to have 5 years of experience, like if you don't have a good story about talking to the CEO, like you're probably not going to get the job, right? But don't put too much pressure at the entry level to feel like you have to have that perfect answer, so much as articulating a real story where you drove real change. And again, I'm never saying lie, that's not the point. Maybe at the time, the manager that you reported to in that story is now the VP of engineering, even though you don't work at that company anymore. I would say, I spoke to the VP of engineering because that is not incorrect, right? These are the small things. Again, I'm never saying lie. I'm never saying make something up. Some people do that. Some people recommend that. Not really my style, right? But again, don't be afraid to own the story. If you drove change, don't worry about the specific titles. If you haven't spoken to a CEO, just think about times that you've driven change, people that maybe have 10 to 20 years more of experience than you in an industry that were taking your input, taking your advice. If you can find stories like that, you're in a great position. And these are the types of deeper dive questions you should expect in a later stage interview in tech sales. So I hope that helped. Again, feel free to comment. I know it's really impossible without making a 5-hour-long video to address every single possible question. So if you have questions that have stumped you in the past, you have questions you're worried about how to prepare for, comment below. Happy to help and provide more insight. But have a great week and we will see you in our next video. Thanks.